So I'm going to talk today about a trip that we just completed a few weeks ago. When I first got to Armenia, you might have noticed I was a little jet-lagged. My husband, who's back here, Ian von Lindern, and I had very recently traveled to Bangladesh, halfway the other way around the world. So it took us a while to adjust. But this is a pretty fascinating, at times depressing, but in other ways, I hope it gives us hope for the future to talk about some of the issues in Dhaka. I'm going to just do an overview about Bangladesh. We'll do a little remembrance of Rana Plaza disaster, and then I'm going to talk about tanneries and some of the other industries that exist in this giant city. And then perhaps we can have some questions, suggestions, discussion about what needs to happen next in a place like this. And I really hope to get some suggestions from you because it's pretty overwhelming. First of all, just to remind us of our geography, where Bangladesh is, halfway the other way around the world, from where we live in Idaho. Bangladesh has about 140 million people. The country is about 5 times as big as Armenia. And the city of Dhaka, the capital, they think has about 14 million people. 7 years ago, they thought it had about 8 million people. So population estimates in cities this big are often hard to get. I wanted to do a little remembrance of the disaster at Rana Plaza, because if you talk about disasters in Bangladesh, this was probably the most recent one that got the most media coverage, and it was almost exactly a year ago when this building collapsed. It was an 8-story building that was originally built to house businesses and residences, and later became one of the thousands of garment factories in Dhaka. So they brought in a lot of heavy equipment, basically turned this building into a factory, which it was not designed to do. And when it collapsed, as you can see, it killed over 1,000 people, injured over 2,500, and at least 800 children were orphaned. It has led to a lot of attention on the ready-made garment industry that Bangladesh pretty much dominates in the world now. It does a lot more of that now than it used to. A lot of the industry that used to be in India and China in ready-made garments has actually moved to Bangladesh for economic reasons. And this was one of thousands of factories like this. In fact, you can imagine this factory collapse happening when you drive through the city and you just see the construction of some of the buildings. It's also led to a lot of discussion about compensation to the victims and to consumer practices in all of us who buy ready-made garments from Bangladesh, from people who work in such very difficult conditions. I'm not going to talk so much about ready-made garments. I'm going to talk about leather, because there are a lot of parallels between the leather industry and this industry. I also wanted to just sort of bring into play why this might have anything to do with Armenia. So I thought I'd start with just an overlay of the size of Armenia and the size of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is about 5 times as large, but as I mentioned, has 140 million people. So it's one of the most populated, densely populated places on Earth. Its elevation of the city of Dhaka is 4 meters. And most of the country is between, I think, 5 and 15 meters above sea level. So Bangladesh is famous for monsoons and famous for flooding. And it's one of the countries that is on probably the top 3 list in the world for pending disasters if the predictions of sea level rising with global warming come true. It doesn't have any room for error. There are 3 places I wanted to point out. While I was thinking about Armenia and thinking about Bangladesh, I happened to discover that there's an Armenian church in Dhaka. I didn't learn that when I was there. I wish I had. If I go back, I'm going to look for it. It's actually in Old Dhaka. And in the 1700s and 1800s, there was a pretty sizable Armenian population there involved in jute and other fabric commercialization. And there's still an Armenian church there. It was recorded in your history books. And it's not too far from where we were. We were in these 2 areas. Hazaribagh is the one that is home to all of the tanneries. 99% of Bangladesh's tanneries are in a 4 square kilometer area. And I'm going to talk briefly about Kamrangachar, which is another very industrialized area. But when I say industrialized, it's little tiny businesses. It's not like giant factories. As you probably know, and as you saw from the bigger map, Bangladesh, and especially the capital city of Dhaka, is dominated by rivers. It's dominated by water. And all of the pollution from the two areas that I've marked there gets dumped into the Buriganga River, which goes into the Ganges, which ends up in the Bay of Bengal. And when you see pictures of the Buriganga River, though, you will be amazed that it even flows because it's so polluted. So here's kind of what we're going to do, a little bit of an overview. We talked about Rana Plaza. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the tanneries and then some of the other communities, and then we'll look at kind of what next. So the tanning industry is over 60 years old. It really grew post-independence in Bangladesh. Hazaribagh employs probably at least 12,000 people. A lot of them are migratory workers. Very difficult to document these kinds of numbers, but they think there's probably at least 150 different tanneries. Some of them are very small and operated in a space about the size of this room, and they make pretty simple leather. And some of them are almost modern technology that make very high-grade leather, the kind you would see in shoes imported from Italy. In fact, most of the leather that goes into Italian shoes is made in Hazaribagh. And the Italian government and a lot of the EU countries buy their leather from Hazaribagh and really play a big role in this whole industry. The export value a couple of years ago was estimated at about $660 million US. It's growing extremely rapidly. This is just a dominant part of the whole leather industry in the world. And most of it is exported, as you might imagine. I wanted to just do a little snapshot of tanneries in the US and also in what I learned in very limited research about tanneries in Armenia. In the US, we used to have a lot of tanneries. We used to have hundreds of tanneries. In Delaware, there were 164. In Adirondack, New York, there were 153. We had thousands of them. Now, there are a few custom tanneries left in the country. Custom meaning really specialty kind of leather. If somebody wants an animal that they've shot tanned a certain way for their own use. I mean, it's not really a commercial industry at all. And most of the tanneries that were operational are now hazardous waste sites. They're closed factories, and they have a huge legacy of toxic pollution. And so what, of course, we don't want to see is that happening in Bangladesh. But that's been the history in our country. We have pretty much, like we've done with a lot of bad polluting industries, we've stopped doing them, we've shipped all of that demand to some poor country somewhere else, and then we buy back the product without having to produce the pollution in our own country and expose our own people to that pollution. So of course there's a lot of ethics involved in that, and it happens all over the world, and the US is terribly guilty of that. We don't have that many really bad polluting industries left because many of them have been exported to other places in the world. And that's happened in a lot of places. In Armenia, I did a little tiny bit of research, and I discovered, according to a researcher at your history museum, that at the beginning of the 20th century there were two tanneries in Yerevan. They became state-owned and renamed the charming names N1 and N2. And I couldn't find any information about their current status. Does anyone happen to know? Are these tanneries still in existence? Do you happen to know where they might be?
To my knowledge, the factories don't work, but this is just personal knowledge, not evidence-based.
So it would be interesting to find out.
People are going through the village places and collecting leather. I personally know people who are doing that. And then shipping to Turkey.
Yeah. So it would be interesting also just to learn about the status. If these factories are closed, they're probably closed, but there's probably a pretty healthy amount of residual pollution. I'd be very surprised if there weren't, because if you close down a tannery and you don't clean it up, there's a lot of pollution that just stays there pretty much forever. And you hope people aren't scavenging those materials or living in those buildings. Here's a picture of part of the tanning industry in Hazaribagh. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures because I think they have a lot of impact. Certainly going there has way more impact than the pictures do, but you get a pretty good sense of what this place looks like. The charming name, Thousand Gardens. In Bangladesh, everything sort of coexists. Rickshaws, animals, people, taxi cabs. And this is some of the product being stored. These are some of the horns from the animals that have been slaughtered. Bangladesh imports animals from China, Pakistan, India. They make leather out of cows, goats, buffalo, pigs, probably everything we can think of. And tanning is a very complicated chemical process. I'm only showing you this not to scare you away, but to say at every step of the process there are a lot of chemicals that get introduced, some of which stay in the leather and some of which stay in the air, in the water, in the soil around the factory, and in the people's food. So there are three big processes. The first one just has to do with preparing the leather for tanning, and then at the end dyeing or painting or finishing the leather. And each of those has a lot of chemicals involved. The first one involves things like pesticides, bactericides, fungicides, and those of you who've been studying hazardous chemical risk assessment with me know those are often very persistent chemicals when they're released into the environment, and they're often quite toxic to humans, just like they are to all the other organisms they're trying to kill. So that's the first step. And you can see here a picture of raw hides. One of the other reasons I want to show lots of pictures is when you think about the chemicals, regardless of what they are, look at how people are handling the material. In all of these pictures, you'll see people generally barefoot, doing things with their hands with no protection whatsoever. There's a process of liming and unhairing the hides, and I'm not going to subject you to some of the more literally gut-wrenching pictures, but it's a pretty ugly, smelly process. In tanning, they're trying to make a stable structure out of the leather. And there's actually two kinds of tanning. Vegetable tanning, which they used to do in Bangladesh, and we do around the world, and is kind of considered the green way of doing tanning, uses a lot less hazardous chemicals, but it's more expensive than chrome tanning. And most of the factories in Hazaribagh use tanning with chromium, and trivalent chromium sulfate is one of the main ingredients. It's not that toxic. In fact, chromium has some uses to the human body, but when it gets oxidized and converted to hexavalent chromium, it's extremely toxic. And that's one of the problems in this industry. So this is sort of what the tanning operation looks like in parts. There are lots of chemicals used. There's a picture of the chromium sulfate. General rule of thumb, the more sophisticated and high quality the leather, the more chemicals they use. So some of the very simple leathers use maybe 5 chemicals. Some of the very fancy leathers that they use for shoes or for belts or for purses use up to 30 chemicals. Just some street scenes. And then the last step, they apply either dyes or paints or protective coatings depending on what the leather is going to be used for. This person is using a spray canister, and he's literally just going, literally just going along the leather like this. And the spray is, you know, all over his face, probably all inside of his lungs. When the air is blowing, you just get this stuff everywhere. And you can imagine the exposure to somebody's lungs when they're doing this day after day, year after year. Again, a variety of binders, waxes, adhesives, paint kinds of products that get used when they do the finishing. I have a little video here that I shot with my phone, and I don't know how the sound will work, but if you listen carefully to the very end, it's kind of an important story about worker exposure. So I hope the sound will be adequate.
Do you know what the dye is, with the paint? Do we know what they're using? It's all right. Okay, these are solvents I got in bottles.
He didn't have any idea anything about the product that he was using, and he's using a brush, and his hands were pretty much, coated with this material every day. Of course, we didn't know what he was using either. I mean, somebody knows, but we didn't have that luxury. Do we need to kill a few lights? Would it show up a little better?
Yeah.
Is that okay with the camera?
Let's
I
try.
think they might show up a little bit better. The other thing that happens after the leather is produced, I think that's a little better. Is that okay?
But we cannot see you.
Ah, because of where I'm standing?
No, because
Oh.
it's too dark.
No, we can open it. You can just turn off the upper part.
No, that's probably not good.
That's worse.
No,
You can open
that's okay.
Maybe
So,
Is this okay or too
is it
bad?
okay? All right.
This is
So
fine.
the other thing that happens when you produce anything is you create waste, and the leather process creates a lot of waste along the way. And we use the term waste. In Bangladesh, really nothing is wasted. It is used for everything. It is made into cooking oils, into soaps, into glue. It's used for feeding chickens. It's used for feeding fish. And I'll show you some pictures just to give you an idea of what that's like. So all of the scrap material, some of it gets boiled down to make organic resins and gelatins that they use for art supplies, for photography materials as we understood it, and for fish food. And you see a lot of stuff like this. So you got to be careful where you step. And mostly these places are also where people live. So every time you see a building, that's probably where a family is living. These were vats of this material. In the next picture you see, it looks kind of like a gelatin when it dries. They boil down the scrap leather, and then they make this gelatinous kind of material, which goes to all kinds of people for various products. But the significant thing for us is it also contains a lot of chromium. So the boiling and drying process doesn't eliminate any of the metal that ends up in there. And when they're using that for feeding chickens and fish and things, then that ends up in the human food supply. There's a lot of air particulate that's generated. And a lot of the people that are working in the recycling of the leather wastes are not considered employees of the tannery. So if you talk to the tannery owners about the wages for workers or occupational safety for workers, they're thinking about the people that are in the factory, but there are probably 100 times that many people working outside of the factory that are literally scavenging those waste materials to find something to make a living on. And those are the people that probably have the worst exposure because they are completely unregulated. They generally don't know anything about the dangers of that material, and they are often itinerant workers, so they're not the same people over and over, which you could argue is good from the exposure point of view, but it makes it very difficult from any kind of an environmental health attention point of view. There are some more pictures. This is all just tannery waste being made into something for sale, being dried so it... one good thing about PowerPoint and video is it doesn't smell. Just leave it at that. So a little bit about health. As you can imagine just from the pictures, there are a lot of hazards, biological hazards. This material carries a lot of different microorganisms. There's inhalation of the dust in all of the waste materials. There's physical hazards, chemical hazards, our regular pathways of ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact, not to mention injuries and work accidents. And as you can probably guess, in a factory like this, if you're injured, you lose your job. Very few of these factories have any kind of compensation for workers. A few of them do, but most of them don't. So if you're injured, you've lost your job, you've lost your livelihood, and now you have an injury, and it isn't like there's national health insurance in Bangladesh to take care of you. A lot of what we know about leather toxicity, we know from other places in the world because tanneries have been around for hundreds of years. These are some pictures of some of the dermal kinds of disorders that you can see from all the people that were handling all this material with their hands and feet without gloves. A long arm glove costs about 85 cents in the US, or about $3.50 dram. So not an expensive solution to that little piece of it. There are also a lot of respiratory issues because there's often poor ventilation. There's not, PPE stands for personal protective equipment, so people aren't wearing masks. They're certainly not wearing respirators. They're exposed to volatile chemicals. There's smoking in the workplace, which makes it worse. From some studies in other countries and similar factories, we know that things like asthma and chronic bronchitis are pretty common in workers just in terms of their short-term exposures. And then in terms of long-term diseases like cancer, because there's such a wide range of chemical agents in various exposure levels, and it's hard to track workers in factories like this, it also matters where in the factory they're working. But again, we do know quite a bit about the cancer risks associated with the chemicals that they're exposed to. Lung cancer, sinonasal cancers, and it's listed here by the possible kind of chemical in the factory, pancreatic cancers associated with people doing the painting and drying using formaldehydes and paints. Testicular cancers, soft tissue carcinomas, bladder cancers, again from some of the dyes, kidney cancers, prostate cancers, so a long range of things. But imagine how hard it is for any kind of a health ministry in a country as poor as Bangladesh, in an industry as unregulated as these tanneries, it would be to try to create a cancer registry of workers. I mean, it hasn't been done, to say the least. The workers do report various health effects, such as the short-term kinds of things you would expect to see: gastrointestinal, respiratory illness, eye, skin conditions like you saw in the picture. But in terms of any kind of long-term occupational health, there really isn't documentation of those health effects in these communities. We can just expect what we know, or expect what we would see based on what we've seen in other communities. And now we're going to jump from workers to the surrounding communities. And when we do that, we have to look at pollution levels. These tanneries produce about 7.7 million liters of liquid waste and 88 million tons of solid waste every day, completely untreated. So the wastewater is not treated, the solid waste is not treated. It gets dumped primarily into the Burraganga River and all of the areas of land on either side of the Burraganga River. One of the things we did that we like to do on any project, you know, people always say, well, did you take any samples? And we did enough of a literature review to know we don't need to take any samples to know how polluted this is. We don't need to spend $100,000 sampling because people have been sampling this place for 20 years. Every university professor has sampled it. A lot of NGOs have sampled it. International agencies have done sampling. There are hundreds and hundreds of reports that tell us how polluted it is. So we said, if we don't really want to do that, we would rather look at the literature, figure out what's missing, if anything's missing, and then focus our sampling efforts on that. But you can see just by glancing at this, the numbers in parentheses are the Bangladesh wastewater pollution standards, if they exist. But the main thing to see is everything far exceeds any standard. I mean, that's pretty obvious when you're dealing with untreated industrial waste. Same thing happens when you look at soil levels. The soil chromium levels extremely high. Bangladesh, as far as we could find, does not have soil levels standards for chromium in soil. Or for hexavalent, the more dangerous part of chromium, there aren't Bangladesh levels, but those are dangerous levels in terms of international standards. If we look at the groundwater, it exceeds what we know are safe levels in groundwater. And if you look at the fish in the river, as you might, well, the fish that survive the river, I should say, it depends on whether there's enough water in the river for fish to survive. And then there are metals detected in the tissues of the fish, but that's a pretty seasonal pattern. When you think about untreated industrial wastewater going into a river that is so heavily inhabited in an area like this, you think about all the ways people use that water. They're using it for cooking, for washing. There are some wells in these communities that provide drinking water, fortunately, and they seem to be okay, although there's some questions about them. But still, water in this river gets used for all kinds of stuff. They don't just use the well water. They use it to wash their vegetables, for example. If you look at the soil, we know that people are always in contact with soil, and we know, for example, that children, especially young children around 2 years old, when they start walking around and exploring the world, eat a lot of soil. And if that soil is contaminated, then they are ingesting a lot of contamination, about 100 milligrams a day for an average 2-year-old child. They're also tracking that soil into their house. There's soil and dust on food. It's in the water. It's on the food utensils. It's hard to avoid. And then there are para-occupational kinds of exposures. For example, children visiting work areas. Children often in communities like this will deliver food to workers, and so they're going into the factories or they're going into the work areas and then bringing that material home. Health effects, we know hexavalent chromium is a known human carcinogen. There are many other heavy metals associated with the tanneries that are neurotoxics, especially to children. Pentachlorophenol is also used as a sort of a preservative that has liver and kidney effects. And just some more beautiful scenes of the river and little effluents to the river, the waterways. You see people fishing, not too successfully, at least for the time of year that we were there. There's also air pollution. So sulfur dioxide becomes sulfuric acid when it contacts water. There's a lot of suspended particulate matter, which is a fancy way of saying there's a lot of dust in the air from lots of sources. And there are a lot of concerns about the food chain. I mentioned that they use the tannery waste for feeding chickens and for feeding fish. And we know that goes through the food chain to humans. There have been some samples of some of that food indicating high levels of chromium, again from the tanneries. And as that material gets dried, it also not only is a pathway from the food, but you're also breathing in the dust. So it also becomes an inhalation toxicant. Not only is the chromium showing up in the chicken feed, but it's also showing up in the chickens. So there was some random sampling in chicken livers, for example, and we know the liver is the organ that does most of the detoxification in your body, so it's also the one that if the food that the chicken is getting is poisonous, probably has the most poison, in this case chromium, in it. There's concern about eggs for trivalent chromium, but so far not for hexavalent chromium. So what's the plan for all of this? 150 odd tanneries, completely untreated waste going in every direction. You see that they've grown from 1947 when they started with vegetable tanning. 50 years later there were 250 tanneries, most of them small cottage industries. This has gotten a lot of attention. If you follow environmental news and you Google Hazaribagh, you'll see a million news stories and videos, and it's just gotten a lot of attention because that part of the Burraganga River is probably the most polluted river on planet Earth. So a lot of people know about it. And in 2002, the then Prime Minister said, okay, we have a solution. We're going to build a new centralized treatment facility. We're going to move all the tanneries. We're going to have a central facility for treating the waste. The tanneries agreed if the government would help them with the money to move, which the government agreed to. Then in 2009, it still hadn't happened. They said the court ordered that the tanneries would move by the year 2010, otherwise they would shut them down. Time goes on. They had another deadline issued by the courts for 2013, and now people are guessing maybe by 2017. So that will have been 20, or what would that be, 15 years after they made this announcement of building this treatment facility. All bets are off as to when and if this will really happen. I mean, everybody in the Bangladesh government says, well, we have a solution. We're going to build this facility. But they've been saying that now for 12 years, and it still hasn't happened. So the economic needle really has to shift in order for that actually to happen, because the tanneries are saying, well, the government promised to help us move, so we're not going to spend our money doing it. And the government's saying, well, you know, we're making a lot of money on these tanneries, and yeah, we're going to do that. So that's kind of where it is right now. But there's another big problem with that whole solution, and that is what happens in Hazaribagh. So if they move all the tanneries and all the jobs go away, there's going to be this 4 square kilometer highly contaminated area. And my guess would be, if it's not cleaned up at the time that the tanneries move, it won't be cleaned up. And other industries will move there, because there are people living there that will need work. Some of them will move with the tanneries, but other things will move in. The population of Dhaka probably increases by 1 million people a year. So other people and other kinds of little factories will move there, and that contamination will still be there. And as far as we could tell while we were there, there hasn't been any discussion about cleaning up what they will leave behind, even if they do move the factories. That's what I'm saying. I hope we have some suggestions at the end of that. So now I'm going to move just for a little while to this triangle-shaped peninsula called Kamrangachar. It's very close to Hazaribagh. It doesn't have any tanneries, but it was described to us as a community of people that can make everything. And when we visited there, it seemed to be true. They make absolutely everything there. These are not, it's not one industry, it's a whole bunch of different things. It's about 3.68 square kilometers with a population of 440,000 people. It's hard to imagine how crowded this community is. A lot of them are people that have just moved in from agricultural parts of Bangladesh where their lives were worse than they are in Kamrangachar. And they have a lot of small-scale factories, and I'm just going to show you some pictures of some of them. One thing that they do a lot of is recycle plastic. Now, those of us who are good environmentalists always like to feel good about recycling, and I don't want you to be discouraged about recycling, but I want you to see that recycling has some downsides in countries like this, because a lot of poor countries that do recycling don't do it in the way that we wish that they did. So they recycle all kinds of plastics here, and they come in probably in every way you can imagine. One of the things that happens first is they sort the plastic by hand according to the type of plastic that it is. And you all know from reading labels that there are lots of different kinds of plastics that we recycle. Usually on the bottom of our water bottles and things, it'll tell us what kind of plastic it is and how and whether or not it can be recycled. And those of us in the so-called developed world are usually pretty proud of this. You know, oh, I'm using a recycled product. This is good. And it also determines the chemicals that went into it when it was produced. So when we take something like a plastic Coca-Cola bottle or a plastic water bottle and we recycle it, we're doing all of this stuff to it, we're breaking it down, we're degrading that material, and we're ending up with raw material that is never as good as what we started with. So two things happen. It's what they call downcycling in recycling. You don't end up with as good a product as you started with. And you also, in this process, are often releasing a lot of the same chemicals that went into making that bottle. And that's where it becomes a problem for the recyclers. They also sort by hand plastics into color. So you'll see these mountains of plastics, and usually women, often with their kids, sorting the plastics into type and sorting them into color. And when that happens, and you start thinking about all of the things that were in those plastic bottles, it just really upsets me because, you know, we put everything into plastic bottles. Pesticides, drinking water, paint, and these almost empty bottles are ending up in a pile and somebody is touching that material and putting it somewhere else. Women and children most frequently. None of us has any idea what's in those materials. So you just kind of look at that and you see a disaster waiting to happen. So here's some, I think these are incoming plastics still. These are some, looks like plastic syringes that also get recycled, so think about that. What's in a syringe? What's in a plastic syringe? The material gets shredded, and the shredding in itself generates a lot of fume and dust, a lot of particulate hazard. It gets washed and dried, as you saw in the schematic. And as you can see in the back there, there's usually goats and animals kind of going through it, seeing if there's anything left that's of value. It becomes a granulated plastic product that then becomes the new raw material for whatever you make the next plastic product out of. So we often think of recycled products as going into things like chairs or flooring materials, or usually not food products because they usually can't be made high enough quality once they're downcycled into something that can contain food. I wouldn't say that it doesn't happen, but usually those downcycled products are less, you know, they're more things like objects that we would have around their house. And besides, of course, all of the chemical wastes, you know, think about all these other hazards that you're seeing. So I mentioned as the plastics break down, you're releasing the material that went into making that plastic. And some of you know from the list over there on the right that some of those materials are quite toxic. So the workers that are in this recycling factory are exposed to these constituents every day. Typical work day, probably 12 to 14 hours. And the workers are often paid by the piece, by how much they produce. So they're not paid by the hour, they're paid according to their production. You can see the little blue granules over there. Those are the raw product for what's going to be made next. And one of the things we watched them making were these blue barrels. So they take all the recycled plastic and they make these barrels. And these barrels you see all over, really all over the world, but all over Bangladesh. And they're used to contain foodstuffs, oils for cooking, paint, plasticizers, all kinds of stuff. They also make melamine formaldehyde dishes in this community. These are just some pictures of some other things they make. They make aluminum cookware, casting. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet that you can really see in this particular factory is the use of child labor. So Bangladesh does have child labor laws, but we saw children that I would guess were as young as 10 years old that worked 12 to 14 hours a day in factories. So this is still the aluminum. This is another little video. This man is making valves, little valves that go into probably a propane stove. It was part of a stove, part of an appliance. And he's making these things really pretty amazingly quickly. And so he's casting these. These are going to go into a furnace. Oops, let me go back here. See if I can get that video to show. There it goes. And here's another picture of those same little valves. And then look at this one. This factory, it's a little hard to see here, but they were making parts of brass lamps. So a little, like a rounded part of a lamp. But watch what this guy is doing on the left.
What I saw in they collect the raw material from the sheep, and the dockyard, which is
I want to show you that one again.
What I saw they collect the raw material from the sheep, and the dockyard.
Imagine doing that with your foot. And this boy was probably about 11 years old. He was being trained to do the same operation. These are, Ian help me out here, I think these were wheels for mechanical tractors, or sometimes we weren't sure what we were seeing. But this was part of the foundry.
Yeah, those were being melted down.
They were what?
Those were the raw materials that melted down.
Oh, these were being recycled. And then they also took old pieces of machinery and melted them down, old scissors. Again, lots of children, people living in these factories oftentimes. We heard that there was a battery recycling operation, which, because we worked so much in lead, we were interested in. We were not allowed it. So I have a blank picture. I have another blank picture of the factory where they supposedly recycle X-ray plates. We can only imagine those kinds of exposures. And then we walked down to the Burraganga River. These are hospital linens from the main Dhaka Medical Center being dried along the side of the river. And it was reported to us that in the river they have done studies and have detected every known antibiotic. I have a few more factory pictures here of children working. This is a balloon factory. So a lot of times when like latex plastics, like latex gloves get recycled, they probably end up in this balloon factory, or they could end up in this balloon factory, which was really mostly children working there, making balloons. And my last picture is sort of the end of the whole leather process. Remember I said that leather waste goes into fish food? Yes. So right near this, in this community, there was a fish farm. I'm going to show you one more video. And this video is called, what I said to myself when I took this picture, Margaret, do not fall in there.
Is that a fish?
Those are fish, those are catfish. The furry things are the, this is the mouth of the catfish. They're coming up. And there are sushi restaurants in Bangladesh. So, what were we doing there? Well, we have worked, tomorrow's seminar is going to be about a project we did in Nigeria with Doctors Without Borders. And this is, we think probably one of the best NGOs there is, because we've worked with them enough to know what great work they do. And they have had clinics in Bangladesh dealing with what they often deal with: infectious disease, they often deal with nutrition. They have a clinic there that deals with sexual violence, with adolescent reproductive health, with drug-resistant TB. But they weren't in this part of Dhaka for very long before they said, you know, really what we need to do is look at the diseases associated with workers, because the normal stuff that we do in dealing with epidemic diseases are probably not as important in this particular community as better understanding the environmental and occupational exposures that the community has just from the kind of pollution that you just saw. So they asked us to help them try to begin to figure out where to start. And you know, one good place to always start is by having good data. And our job was sort of to look at the environmental data. And Doctors Without Borders would like to, in their clinics, begin to have at least clinical documentation of occupational disease, because those kind of registries really don't exist in the country. But of course, the big ultimate goal is to make things better. Ian and I started a foundation, a very small foundation called TerraGraphics, and our job has been to work with communities to help reduce environmental exposures. So what we're trying to do with MSF is sort of a combination of the environmental piece and the medical practice that they bring. And I want to just end with this slide because I don't want it to end too pessimistically. I really do believe that in any country where we talk about government inaction and we talk about corporations that are irresponsible, that we can fix that. It's not unusual. Everywhere I go in the world, people say, oh, but our government won't do this, and oh, the corporations are crooked, and it'll never change. And if you stay for the seminar tomorrow about Nigeria, we made change in Nigeria. It took 4 long, difficult years, and that is a very difficult place to work in. And it's known for its corruption, and it's known for all the things you hear about, but change can happen. And there are key things that we believe make change happen. Number one is the local communities. And local communities are often the ones that feel like they have the least power, because they are, in a sense, the victims of the government or the victims of their employers, but they really can lead to change if they feel like there's any hope involved. Educational institutions, a lot of the work that the School of Public Health and the other departments here at AUA are doing are beginning to gather data. They're gathering information, they're working with communities, they're saying change can happen. We can get from here to here. It's going to take a while. We got to learn to trust each other, but we can do it. Nonprofits can play a huge role. Sometimes they fight with each other, but generally you hope that they're all aiming towards something better. How the legal system plays out in different countries makes a big difference. In America, we're sort of famous for anybody can sue anybody for anything at any time. It has its advantages and disadvantages. But there are always some sort of legal systems that can be brought into play in most countries. I think the role of the media is really the one that this generation can take advantage of in ways that no previous generation could. Because nowadays, the rest of the world can know about places like Hazaribagh and Kamranghachar, where if you think 100 years ago, a handful of people around the world knew about those places. That has changed rapidly. And Ian and I have done enough international environmental work to know that people in these communities know what's happening in communities like theirs around the world, and helps them understand that change can happen. Media by itself can't do it, but if there isn't open press and free media, it's a lot harder. Health officials, of course, scientists and engineers, the role of the industry is key. The role of consumers, especially in places like Bangladesh, has gotten a lot of attention. Countries like the United States, countries in Europe, after Rana Plaza happened and after they learned more about these places like these leather tanneries, start to feel kind of guilty, as they well should, because their desire to have cheap products is what helps propel that industry into not doing anything. So consumers have a big obligation. After Rana Plaza, There's been a lot of international attention to the kinds of businesses that buy those products, where they end up, who buys them. The most progressive commitments after that particular disaster were made by the EU and Canada. The United States did not sign on because some of our big businesses said, oh, you know, we think we can do this in some other way. So they signed a different agreement that wasn't as good, but it's better than nothing. But as we've learned in this class, and as we've learned, it seems like on planet Earth, it often takes disasters before action happens. I hope that isn't the case in the leather industry, but it could well be. And tied to the industry, the consumers, the government, you have to have some source of money to make change happen. And all of these things really have to network together. But we've seen it happen. And I really hope that you can think of yourself as the snowflake that starts the next avalanche, because nobody ever thinks they're that snowflake, but it does happen. And I think as long as we have networks like this working together, we can see change. So I will end there, and I should say, do you have any suggestions for us, in addition to maybe having some questions? It's a pretty overwhelming place, and we came back going, where do we start? Any questions about anything you saw? Yes?
Thanks for the interesting presentation. My question is related to the key players that could help to fight those environmental disasters. Particularly, I have a question related to the local communities. How can we deal with the resistance to change, and even if the simple actions like increasing awareness are so resistant in these communities? What can we do in this case?
Well, and I'll ask Ian to help me answer this, because we've dealt with this everywhere we've ever been, especially when communities, and I know you're working in the mining industries, you know, communities that are dependent on a certain industry for their income are by nature resistant to change, because they fear it's going to change the stability of their employment. But you know, part of what we've learned in a lot of environmental issues is it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be, I either have a job and sacrifice my health, or the factory closes and I have a safe environment. There are compromises to be made, and there are changes that can make a safe workplace. People are entitled to having a safe place to work and an economic stability, but that shouldn't be at the sacrifice of their health. So I think that, I mean, you said what the first step is awareness. And yeah, people, there will always be people that reject it, but you will also have other people who will say, well, wait a minute, I didn't realize that. And sometimes it's the leaders within the community who appear, who begin to become trusted within their own community to help make those changes. But it isn't easy. Ian, would you like to add something to that?
Well, what we have learned is that most of these changes have to be implemented within existing institutions in the local community. You can't bring an outside group and a new entity to do these things. And that seems daunting at the beginning, but it's often amazing how competent the people in those institutions are in the healthcare that they provide, even in the environmental agencies that we have worked with in several of these countries. The staff people are quite competent. They're well trained. It's the upper level that's usually the problem. And we always try to work with the staffs, try and implement the programs from the middle or the bottom, and then try and bring the upper administrative levels along. The upper administrative levels usually respond to the politics, so they need to be shown that there is a possibility of accomplishing work with their own staff. And then the attitude of the community needs to change, that this can't happen without being a threat to their Social Security.
We've often also seen the development and helped with the development of community task forces. where you get a group of maybe 10 or 12 citizens together, and those citizens can be people who work at the plant, they can be perhaps a local official, perhaps just citizens who live there, who don't work at the plant, but really people who represent the community. And usually when groups like that form, they start out kind of like they don't trust each other. They're standing there with their hands folded, like, why are you here? What do you want from this? But if you stick with it, community groups can really make a big difference because it is their community. And if they can develop levels of trust and develop common goals, they can figure out within their communities how to work towards them. Yes?
Speaking on the tanneries, like 99% of the production from the town has been exported.
Yes.
Right? And most of the customers of those tanneries are developed from the developed countries.
Yes.
And most of the countries who purchase and give the orders are committed to and signed with WTO, World Trade Organization. Mm-hmm. And how about driving a strategy, asking WTO when they sign for an production unit for their purchase, they have to compel all these demands so that the order can be placed to that company. Otherwise, it won't be rejected.
Right.
And known like the US companies doesn't follow any rules outside offshore companies, but other countries, say for example, because I'm from a town where around like 100 kilometers from my town, we also have a biggest tannery in India, next to Kanpur, and what they did is like they had their own efferent wastewater treatment plant.
Right.
And it is all because of the local state government. They initiated and they did that in that way. Yeah. And also comparing seeing the economic part of the tanneries in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, we can have a high level of draft which the company should place, because there more than the tannery pollution, all those things, child labor is the biggest issue in Bangladesh, where this thing could help.
Cheap labor that drives
very cheap labor, and people start to work from the age of 9 or even less than that.
I mean, part of, the part that gives me hope, and I have to struggle for this sometimes, we know how to fix these things. These are not mysteries. We know how to treat tannery waste. It's not like we're dealing with some pollutant that we don't know how to deal with. The issues are financial to some degree, because it's consumer driven, it's industry competition driven, it's labor wages driven, it's government resistance driven, but it's not technology. It's not a technology mystery. So it's a matter of getting people to make those commitments, like you said, with the purchasers. Part of what happened after Rana Plaza and could happen here is if the Italian company that makes the shoes from one of these factories says, we're only going to buy shoes from factories that meet these goals for pollution, for child labor, for salaries, let's say. How long does it take that change to happen? So sometimes consumers get upset and they say, well, I'm just going to boycott that company because they buy stuff from an improper vendor. Well, a boycott, my way of thinking, is not a solution. It can get a lot of media, but the immediate impact might be that factory closes, those people don't have any jobs, and they don't have any way to eat. So the impacts are quite immediate and sudden. So a really better process is one that says, we, the Italian shoe manufacturer, are going to make an investment in your factory so that we can promise you we will continue to buy this product from you, and over the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to make these improvements. I mean, that's how I see it happening. And that some of that pressure has to come from consumers, some of it has to come from regulators, some of it has to come from the industry itself to remain competitive. Let's have somebody else, and I'll come back to you in a sec. Anybody else have a question? Yes?
it's not a question, but more of a comment. I think that it's not merely about this worker safety, but also about the never-ending waste that we are creating in the environment, because we cannot really recycle, for example, the plastic, because you recycle and then, I mean, you create something else that you can recycle, but it still, you know, stays in the environment. But I think that we need to create some kind of innovative substitutes to this kind of products, such as that will be easier to recycle and get over.
Well, you know, a lot of people are looking at creating things that are sustainable in real ways. I mean, recycling is a good thing, because we're stuck with a lot of this stuff. We better do something. Everything has to go somewhere. So we have to do something with it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, for a long time, we've manufactured things and never thought about the end of it, the end of its life. Where will it go? You know, we used to abandon cars. Now we figured out we can recycle cars. We can recycle parts of cars. Some car manufacturers are getting better at labeling the parts of cars so we know how they can be recycled and manufacturing them the best. Same thing with computers. You know, a lot of the more innovative companies are making it so that the e-waste has a true value that you can recover. But certainly when we first started those industries, you know, we did a terrible job. And I think those are lessons that we're learning, but we're not learning them very quickly. Yes?
You said that the Tanneries are going to move to other place. They're planning to do so.
They're planning to.
So, what are the ways of cleaning of waste? Are there well-known ways? Like, we know that if we have decided to clean the heavy metals from soil, there are well-known methods yet for remediation plants, some planting of trees and so on. So, are there any well-known methods of cleaning of such kind of waste that are left behind?
Yeah, I mean, so we have the waste that would be left behind would be primarily in the river and in the soil. The river, because of Bangladesh's monsoon season, tends to wash itself out somewhat, but the sediments in that river are horrifically contaminated. There would probably have to be studies whether they could even dredge up those materials and treat them, or whether it would be better not to do that, because there can be dangers either way. But the soil material, I think it's probably so contaminated, but it's a relatively small area, that some of the soil they might have to actually remove and do physical chemical treatment processes. Others they might just decide to cap in place and make sure that at least you're keeping the rainwater from moving down into it, but with the low groundwater there, that becomes problematic. But I mean, the quick answer is we know how to do it. I can't tell you exactly how it should be done there. And it will be driven by, you know, if there's even money to do cleanup, or if they try to just regulate what kind of land uses go there next. I mean, in Bangladesh, that might be what they do. In the United States, you know, a site like that, we would spend $100 million and clean it up. But that isn't a very practical solution to suggest in Dhaka. So they will have to look at some more innovative things. You know, I was wondering, couldn't they just build the sewage treatment facility or the effluent treatment facility there rather than moving all the tanneries? Because, you know, that would at least keep the economic stability there, and you could make improvements on everything while you still have that economic source there. Space is a problem. You know, 400,000 people in 4 square kilometers. There's not a lot of place to build the size of a treatment facility. They'd probably need about 20% of that community to build it. So that becomes a problem. Ian, do you have anything you'd add to that answer?
We weren't able to find out why they originally had decided to move, because some of the tannery owners themselves told us exactly what Margaret said. I don't know why they don't build a treatment plant here for us instead of asking us.
Probably somebody was making some more money in this new place or something.
All Bangladeshis believe there's corruption behind every move that's made, and they're probably right. It's much more horrendous environmental problems, horrendous health problems, no doubt about that. In that area, I found these numbers unbelievable. They slaughter most of those cows during a religious holiday called Eid. In the city, they slaughter 7 million cattle in 1 week. And then meat goes one place, all the rest comes to the garden. And it's processed over the following year. So the problems there are just mind-boggling. But nevertheless, solutions require people solutions, not technical solutions.
Yeah.
And it will require the political will of the government at some point to address it. And then it can be done.
Yes.
Yes, I have one suggestion which might seem a little bit unrealistic now, but I think we can work towards that in the future. When I was hearing your presentation, I was thinking, oh my God, the problems are so similar in all communities, and maybe it will be useful to create networks between affected communities, not only inside one country, but international networks. So when, for example, we are working with Armenian local communities, they think that they are the only community who face this kind of problems.
Exactly.
They are completely hopeless.
Yeah.
They don't see any future. I think that those connections may help them to see that this is global
And that something can change.
Yes.
And when I say media, I mean in the broadest way, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes that's already happening, but I think we can facilitate it. Ian and I, about 10 years ago, were visiting a lead smelter in Zambia, in Africa, and we met a young man who worked for an NGO there, and it was an NGO of maybe 4 people. I mean, it was him and his 3 friends. But they were going to do environmental cleanup in this copper smelter in Zambia. And we got to talking to him, and this was 10 years ago, when the internet still seemed kind of new to some of us older people, 2004. And he had researched similar facilities around the world from his little computer terminal in Zambia, and he knew some of the work that Ian, my husband, had done in Dallas, Texas in the 1990s. And that was it was sort of that day that I realized the world is changing, because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, he would have been so isolated that he would have never known how another community dealt with something similar and that there was some resolution. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think, when we talk about local communities, that's probably one of the best things you can do is make them realize that, no, you don't have to close the factories like we sometimes do in America. That isn't the solution by any means, and that there are communities who have figured out ways to, on a daily basis, make their life a little better, a little safer. It helps the industry because their workers are going to be happier. There's more trust in the community that can develop. But I think you're absolutely right. Just hooking communities up with one another is a real first step. That's a great idea. Did you have a question? Yes.
Are you interested in the situation in Armenia?
I'm sorry?
Are you interested in the situation in Armenia?
I'm here for the 3rd time. Of course I am.
It's not much better because they cut forests because of gold mines and copper mines and other mines, and the biodiversity is very precious in Armenia. There are very rare animals and birds which they damage, which they hurt, and some of them are on the verge of extinction.
Yes.
And you know that in the towns like Alaverdi and others where the mines are, there are already children without teeth.
Yeah.
And there are people without skin.
Yeah.
They are not working there.
Just from living there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have a very good mineral water Jermu, and just 10 kilometers from the town of Jermu, Prince Charles, of Wales, Prince Charles is digging a gold mine, and they are going to destroy all the nature and the water and the summer resort, and there are about 500 mines, if I'm not mistaken. And Armenia is 1/5 of Bangladesh.
Yeah.
The situation is just terrible.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
are you interested in doing some research here?
Yes, well, Ian and I have been keeping track of what Varduli and her team have been working on, a little bit on the sidelines. Tomorrow, just as a little bit of an advertisement, Ian is going to give a seminar at the same time at 5:30, and his seminar is about the price of metals, where there are metals in the world, and how the exploitation happens on a global scale. So it is something we're very interested in and have worked in really for all of our careers. And a lot of what we, what little we know and have seen about Armenia, I mean, I have a lot of worries for this country because you do have some good resources, and everybody in the world knows where the resources are now. So being able to use the resources wisely, resources meaning not only the metals, but also the forest and the biodiversity that you have, is a challenge. Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
Armenia is, maybe you know, it's a very ancient country, historically, culturally. We have a very great cultural heritage.
Yes.
We have ancient churches and temples and things like that, which are much more precious than these kilogram temples.
I totally agree.
That are dug out and expensive to people's health and animal world and forage and nature and everything.
Yeah.
And it's a very good place for tourists because this is a very ancient, unique country, Maybe it's better to look at Armenia as from that point of view, as a source of some metals or stones.
Well, and some countries, the country that pops into mind that has had a very unique little spot in its part of the world is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is surrounded by other countries in Latin America who've done pretty traditional resource development and so forth. Costa Rica said, we're never going to have a military. We're going to develop our whole industry around ecotourism. And they have been wildly successful. So, I mean, there are countries who have been able to pull things off like what you're describing. It's not easy to do. There will always be people to resist it. But why not? I mean, the first time I came to Armenia, I said, this is such a unique part of the world. It's a magic place. It really is.
Surrounded by some countries, which are called enemies.
Everybody's surrounded by somebody else that's not so easy. Well, I think we should probably end there. I'll hang around, Ian and I will hang around if you have some questions you want to come up individually, but I thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we should have the two birthday girls stand one more time. So stand. You have to look for the next generation for the solutions.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret, very much.